Atlantis, the lost island empire where Poseidon himself walked among mortals. A civilization of breathtaking temples covered in silver and gold. A land blessed with hot springs and cold fountains, with elephants roaming wild and a mysterious glowing metal found nowhere else on earth. 10 kings ruling in perfect harmony under sacred laws. This is the story of the most famous vanished civilization in all of human history, and the endless quest to understand what became of it. Plato was born in Athens around 428 or 427 years before the Common Era. This was a turbulent time in Greek history. The Great War between Athens and Sparta, known as the Peloponnesian War, had begun just a few years earlier. It would rage for nearly 3 decades, reshaping the Greek world and leaving Athens humbled and diminished. The Athens into which Plato was born was still at the height of its power and cultural achievement. The Parthenon, that magnificent temple to Athena, stood gleaming on the Acropolis. The great statesman Pericles had recently guided the city through its golden age. Drama, philosophy, sculpture, and architecture all flourished. It was one of those rare moments in history when human creativity seemed to reach a peak. Plato came from one of the most distinguished families in the city. His father, Ariston, traced his ancestry back to the early kings of Athens. His mother Perictione was descended from Dropides, a close friend and relative of the great lawgiver Solon. This connection to Solon would prove significant, for it is through Solon that Plato claims the Atlantis story was transmitted to Greece. The young Plato grew up surrounded by privilege and intellectual stimulation. He received the education appropriate to an aristocratic Athenian youth, which included physical training, music, poetry, and mathematics. He showed early promise as a poet and may have written tragedies before turning to philosophy. The decisive influence on Plato's life came in the form of an unusual man who could be found wandering the streets and marketplaces of Athens. This man was Socrates, and his impact on Western thought would prove immeasurable. Socrates was unlike any philosopher who had come before. He wrote nothing, he charged no fees for his teaching, he claimed to know nothing at all. Yet he spent his days engaging anyone who would listen in philosophical conversation, asking probing questions that exposed the contradictions in their beliefs. The Socratic method, as it came to be known, was a form of inquiry based on asking and answering questions. Socrates would begin by asking someone to define a concept, such as justice or courage or piety. When the person offered a definition, Socrates would ask further questions that revealed problems with that definition. Through this process of questioning, both participants would move closer to understanding, even if they never arrived at a final answer. Plato became one of Socrates' most devoted followers. For perhaps 20 years, he listened to his teacher's conversations, absorbed his methods, and developed his own philosophical views. The relationship between the two men was deep and transformative. In many ways, Plato's entire philosophical project can be seen as an attempt to continue and expand upon the work that Socrates began. But this golden period of learning came to a tragic end. In 399 before the Common Era, Socrates was put on trial by the Athenian democracy. The charges against him were vague but serious: corrupting the youth of Athens and failing to acknowledge the gods that the city acknowledged. Behind these formal charges lay political resentments and personal grudges accumulated over decades of Socratic questioning. The trial of Socrates was a pivotal moment in Western history. Socrates defended himself not by apologizing or seeking mercy, but by explaining and justifying his philosophical mission. He argued that his questioning was a service to the city, that an unexamined life was not worth living, and that he would continue his work regardless of the consequences. The jury was not persuaded. Socrates was found guilty and sentenced to death by drinking poison hemlock. Plato was present at the trial, though illness prevented him from being with his teacher at the moment of death. The execution of Socrates shattered Plato's world and shaped the rest of his life. In the years following Socrates' death, Plato left Athens and travelled widely. He visited Italy, where he encountered the followers of Pythagoras, the mathematician and mystic who believed that numbers were the key to understanding reality. He journeyed to Sicily, where he became involved in the politics of Syracuse and its tyrant Dionysius. These experiences broadened his perspective and deepened his thinking. Eventually, around 387 before the Common Era, Plato returned to Athens and founded a school of philosophy. It was located in a grove sacred to the hero Academus, just outside the city walls, and so it came to be called the Academy. This institution would continue to operate for nearly 900 years, making it one of the longest-lasting schools in human history. At the Academy, Plato gathered students and colleagues to study philosophy, mathematics, and astronomy. The curriculum was rigorous and demanding. A famous inscription above the entrance reportedly read, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here." Mathematics was seen not just as a practical skill, but as training for the mind, preparing it to grasp abstract truths. Among the students who passed through the academy was a young man from Stagira named Aristotle. He would study with Plato for 20 years, before eventually founding his own school and developing his own philosophical system. The relationship between Plato and Aristotle and the differences between their approaches would shape Western philosophy for millennia to come. It was during his years at the Academy that Plato wrote most of his philosophical works. These took the form of dialogues, conversations between various characters who debate philosophical questions. In most of these dialogues, the central figure is Socrates, whom Plato uses as a mouthpiece for his own ideas while also honouring the memory of his beloved teacher. Plato's dialogues are remarkable works of literature as well as philosophy. They feature vivid characters, dramatic situations, and beautiful prose. Reading them, one can almost hear the voices of the participants, feel the tension of the debates, and share in the excitement of philosophical discovery. The dialogues cover an enormous range of topics. The Republic explores the nature of justice and the ideal state. The Symposium examines the nature of love. The Phaedo discusses the immortality of the soul. The Theaetetus investigates the nature of knowledge. Together, these works form one of the foundations of Western philosophy. The dialogues that contain the Atlantis story are called Timaeus and Critias. They were written late in Plato's life, probably around 360 before the Common Era, when he was in his late 60s. These are among his most ambitious works, attempting to describe the origin of the universe, the nature of the physical world, and the history of human civilization. Timaeus and Critias are closely connected to the Republic. In fact, they appear to be a kind of sequel or continuation. The Republic presents Plato's vision of the ideal state in theoretical terms, describing how such a state should be organized and governed. At the beginning of Timaeus, Socrates expresses a wish to see this ideal state in action, to hear a story that would show it not as a static blueprint, but as a living community engaged in real struggles. This request sets the stage for the Atlantis narrative. One of the characters, Critias, responds by offering to tell a story that will satisfy Socrates' wish. It is a story about ancient Athens, which Critias claims once embodied the ideals described in the Republic. And it is a story about Atlantis, a powerful empire that threatened Athens and all of civilization, only to be defeated and then destroyed. The story is presented through an elaborate chain of transmission. Critias says he heard it when he was a child, from his grandfather, who was also named Critias. The elder Critias heard it from his father, Dropides, and Dropides heard it from his friend and relative, the great Athenian lawgiver Solon. Solon is a historical figure of immense importance. He lived from around 630 to 560 before the Common Era and is remembered as one of the founders of Athenian democracy. He reformed the laws of Athens, abolished debt slavery, and created a more balanced political system. He was also known as a poet and a wise man, one of the legendary 7 sages of Greece. According to Plato's account, Solon travelled to Egypt around 600 before the Common Era. This was not unusual for a Greek of his time and station. Egypt was an ancient and respected civilization, a source of wisdom and learning. Greek intellectuals often visited Egypt to study with its priests and learn from its long history. In the Egyptian city of Sais, Solon encountered priests who told him remarkable things. They explained that Greek civilization had been repeatedly destroyed by catastrophes, both natural and man-made. Each time, the Greeks had to start over, losing the memory of what had come before. But Egypt, protected by its geography from the worst of these disasters, had preserved records going back thousands of years. The priests told Solon that his own city of Athens was far older than he realized. 9,000 years before his time, they said, Athens had been a great and virtuous state. It had stood alone against a mighty empire that threatened to conquer the entire Mediterranean world. That empire was Atlantis. This chain of transmission from Egyptian priests to Solon to Dropides to the elder Critias to the younger Critias to Plato gives the story an air of antiquity and authority. It suggests that Plato was not inventing the tale but recording an ancient tradition that had been carefully preserved. But how much of this should we believe? Did Solon really travel to Egypt and hear this story? Did he really pass it down through his family until it reached Plato? These questions have been debated for centuries, and there is no definitive answer. We know that Solon was a real person who really did travel. After completing his reforms in Athens, Egypt would have been a plausible destination. We also know that Plato was genuinely related to Solon through his mother's family, so the family connection is authentic. However, there is no independent evidence that Solon ever heard the Atlantis story or transmitted it to anyone. No other ancient author mentions the tale before Plato. No Egyptian records of the story have ever been found. The silence is significant. If such a remarkable account had been circulating in Athens for 200 years, we might expect some trace of it in the historical record. Furthermore, some details in Plato's account seem designed more for philosophical purposes than historical accuracy. The date of 9,000 years before Solon would place the events around 9600 before the Common Era, during the last ice age. At that time, human beings had not yet developed agriculture, let alone built cities or empires. The idea of sophisticated civilizations at such an early date conflicts with everything archaeology has revealed about human prehistory. Many scholars therefore conclude that Plato invented the Atlantis story, or at least significantly embellished whatever traditions he may have encountered. The tale serves his philosophical purposes perfectly. It presents ancient Athens as an example of the ideal state described in the Republic, and it shows this virtuous society triumphing over a corrupt and aggressive empire. Yet we should be careful not to dismiss the story too quickly. Plato himself insists, through the voice of Critias, that the account is true. He distinguishes it from the myths and fables that appear elsewhere in his dialogues. He provides specific details about geography, architecture, and social organization that go far beyond what would be necessary for a simple moral tale. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. Perhaps Plato heard fragments of ancient traditions, memories of real catastrophes and lost civilizations, and wove them together into a coherent narrative that served his philosophical purposes. Perhaps there is a kernel of historical truth buried within the legend, waiting to be discovered by future generations. Whatever the case may be, the story that Plato told has proven remarkably enduring. It has outlasted empires and survived the rise and fall of countless civilizations. It has been translated into every major language and studied by scholars on every continent, and it continues to inspire wonder and curiosity more than 2,000 years after it was first written down. Now let us turn to the story itself. Let us hear what Plato actually said about Atlantis, in all its vivid and magnificent detail. The first thing Plato tells us about Atlantis is where it was located. According to his account, the island lay beyond the Pillars of Heracles in the great ocean that the Greeks called the Atlantic. The Pillars of Heracles were the ancient name for the Strait of Gibraltar, that narrow passage where the Mediterranean Sea meets the Atlantic Ocean. Today, we can stand on the southern tip of Spain and look across the water to Morocco, seeing both pillars at once. For the ancient Greeks, the Pillars of Heracles marked the edge of the known world. Beyond them lay mystery and danger. Sailors who ventured past the pillars entered waters that were largely uncharted, where strange currents flowed and unknown lands might be encountered. It was the perfect location for a legendary civilization, far enough away to be mysterious, yet close enough to be imaginable. Plato describes Atlantis as an island larger than Libya and Asia combined. Now, we must understand what these terms meant to an ancient Greek. Libya, in Plato's time, referred to the entire northern coast of Africa that was known to the Greeks. Asia meant the western portion of what we now call Asia Minor, roughly corresponding to modern Turkey. Together, these regions represented a vast territory, suggesting that Atlantis was a continent-sized landmass. The island was situated in the Atlantic Ocean, facing the region that Plato calls the Pillars of Heracles. From Atlantis, travellers could reach other islands, and from those islands, they could reach the opposite continent that surrounded the true ocean. This description is fascinating because it suggests a geography remarkably similar to what we now know exists. The Atlantic Ocean does contain islands, and beyond them lies the American continent, which does indeed surround the ocean on its western side. Some researchers have pointed to this passage as evidence that the ancient Greeks, or perhaps the Egyptians from whom they supposedly learned the story, had knowledge of the Americas long before Columbus. Others argue that Plato was simply imagining what might exist beyond the known world, and that any resemblance to actual geography is coincidental. The position of Atlantis in the Atlantic Ocean is significant for several reasons. First, it places the island in waters that were genuinely mysterious to the ancient Greeks. Second, it provides a plausible explanation for why the island had never been found. The Atlantic was vast and dangerous, and few Greek sailors ventured far into its waters. Third, it sets up the geographical framework for the story that follows, in which Atlantis threatens the Mediterranean world from its base in the Western Ocean. Plato also tells us that after Atlantis sank, the ocean in that region became impassable. The shallow mud left behind by the sunken island made navigation impossible. This detail may reflect actual conditions in parts of the Atlantic, where shallow waters and strong currents can make sailing difficult. It also provides a convenient explanation for why no one had been able to find Atlantis or verify its existence. The climate of Atlantis, according to Plato's description, was mild and favourable. The island enjoyed abundant rainfall and fertile soil. Crops grew easily, and the land supported a wide variety of plants and animals. This description suggests a temperate or subtropical climate consistent with the latitude of the Atlantic Ocean west of Gibraltar. Plato mentions that Atlantis was blessed with natural hot springs as well as cold springs. This detail is intriguing because it suggests volcanic activity. Hot springs are typically found in regions with geothermal energy, often associated with volcanoes or tectonic activity. This has led some researchers to connect Atlantis with volcanic islands in the Atlantic, such as the Azores or the Canary Islands. The surrounding waters of Atlantis were rich with marine life. Fish were abundant, and the harbours teemed with vessels from many lands. The island's position in the Atlantic would have given it access to some of the richest fishing grounds in the world. The Atlantic Ocean, particularly in the regions near the continental shelves, supports enormous populations of fish and other sea creatures. Beyond the immediate vicinity of Atlantis, Plato describes a broader geography. He mentions other islands that lay between Atlantis and the continent on the opposite side of the ocean. These islands served as stepping stones for travellers, allowing them to cross the vast Atlantic in stages. This description has led some to identify these islands with the Azores, Madeira, the Canary Islands, or even the Caribbean. The opposite continent that Plato mentions is described as surrounding the true ocean. This language suggests that the Mediterranean, which the Greeks knew well, was merely an inland sea, while the Atlantic was the true ocean that encircled the world. The continent on the far side of this ocean would then be what we now call the Americas, a landmass that does indeed stretch from the Arctic to the Antarctic, surrounding the Atlantic on its western side. This geographical framework has profound implications. If Plato was accurately describing real geography, then either he or his sources had knowledge of the Atlantic world that we do not usually attribute to the ancient Greeks. If he was inventing or imagining this geography, then he did so with remarkable prescience, creating a picture that would prove surprisingly accurate when Europeans finally crossed the Atlantic 2,000 years later. The location of Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Heracles has been both a blessing and a curse for those who seek to find it. On one hand, it provides a specific geographical reference point. On the other hand, the Atlantic Ocean is vast and the description could potentially fit many different locations. This ambiguity has allowed researchers to propose sites ranging from the mid-Atlantic ridge to the coast of Spain to the Caribbean Sea. Some have argued that Plato's geography should not be taken literally. Perhaps the Pillars of Heracles referred to a different location in ancient times. Perhaps the distances and sizes were exaggerated for dramatic effect. Perhaps the entire geographical framework was symbolic rather than literal, representing spiritual or philosophical truths rather than physical realities. These questions remain open, and we will explore them further when we examine the various theories about Atlantis' location. For now, let us simply appreciate the vivid geographical picture that Plato painted. An island continent in the Western Ocean, blessed with abundant resources and favourable climate, positioned to dominate the Atlantic world and threaten the Mediterranean. This is the setting for the remarkable civilization that we will now explore in detail. Having established where Atlantis was located, Plato proceeds to describe the island itself in remarkable detail. His account paints a picture of a place that was both naturally beautiful and magnificently developed, a paradise enhanced by human ingenuity and divine favour. The island of Atlantis was dominated by a central feature that Plato describes with particular care. Near the middle of the island, about 50 stadia from the sea, there was a plain. A stadion was a Greek unit of measurement roughly equal to 600 feet, or about 180 metres. So this plain was located approximately 9 kilometres or 5.5 miles from the coast. On this plain stood a low mountain, and on this mountain lived a woman named Cleito. Her story, and her union with the god Poseidon, would give rise to the entire Atlantean civilization. But before we tell that story, let us examine what Poseidon did to the mountain where Cleito lived. The god of the sea transformed the landscape around Cleito's dwelling into something extraordinary. He carved the earth around the central hill, creating alternating rings of sea and land. There were 2 rings of land and 3 rings of water, all perfectly circular and concentric, with the central island at their heart. The rings were arranged so that each ring of land was separated from the next by a ring of water, like the rings of a target or the layers of an onion. This pattern of concentric rings would become the defining feature of Atlantean geography. The central island where Cleito lived, and where the palace of the kings would eventually stand, was surrounded by a ring of water. Beyond that was a ring of land, then another ring of water, then another ring of land, and finally an outermost ring of water that connected to the sea. The dimensions of these rings were precisely specified by Plato. The central island had a diameter of 5 stadia, roughly 900 meters or half a mile. The first ring of water surrounding it was 1 stadion wide, about 180 meters. The first ring of land was 2 stadia wide, roughly 360 meters. The second ring of water was 2 stadia wide. The second ring of land was 3 stadia wide, and the outermost ring of water was 3 stadia wide. If we add all these measurements together, we get a total diameter of about 27 stadia, or roughly 5 kilometers, or 3 miles. This was the size of the central complex of Atlantis, the heart of the civilization, where the palace and the most sacred temples stood. Poseidon made the rings of water impassable by ordinary means. No ships could sail from one ring to another without special arrangements. This provided natural protection for the central island, making it a fortress as well as a palace. Only those who knew the secret passages could reach the innermost sanctum where the kings dwelt. The god also provided the island with abundant water. 2 springs flowed from the ground, one hot and one cold. The hot spring suggests geothermal activity, perhaps indicating that the central hill was volcanic in origin. These springs provided water for baths, for drinking, and for irrigation. The water was channeled throughout the city, serving both practical and aesthetic purposes. The Atlanteans, over many generations, enhanced and elaborated upon what Poseidon had created. They built bridges across the rings of water, connecting the rings of land to each other and to the mainland beyond. These bridges were wide enough for a single chariot to pass, allowing traffic to flow between the different zones of the city. They also dug a great canal from the outermost ring of water to the sea. This canal was 300 feet wide, 100 feet deep, and 50 stadia long, connecting the circular harbour system to the open ocean. Ships could sail up this canal and enter the ring system, accessing the harbours and docks that lined the rings of water. The canal was a remarkable feat of engineering. 50 stadia is roughly 9 kilometres or 5.5 miles. Digging a channel of such dimensions through solid earth would have required enormous labour and sophisticated planning. The Atlanteans, according to Plato, were capable of such feats, possessing engineering knowledge that rivaled or exceeded anything known in the ancient Mediterranean world. The rings of land were developed with care and artistry. The innermost ring, closest to the central island, was reserved for the royal guard and the most trusted servants of the kings. The next ring outward contained temples, gardens, and exercise grounds. The outermost ring of land held shipyards, warehouses, and the bustling commercial activity of a great trading civilization. The harbours created by the rings of water were crowded with ships from many lands. Merchants came from across the known world to trade with Atlantis, bringing exotic goods and carrying away the products of Atlantean industry. The sound of commerce filled the air, the calls of sailors, the creak of ropes, the splash of oars in the water. Beyond the ring system lay the great plain of Atlantis. This plain was rectangular in shape, measuring 3,000 stadia by 2,000 stadia, roughly 540 kilometres by 360 kilometres, or 335 miles by 224 miles. This is an enormous area, larger than many modern countries. The plain was naturally fertile, but the Atlanteans improved it further through engineering. They dug a great ditch around the entire perimeter, creating a channel 100 feet wide, 1 stadion deep, and 10,000 stadia in total length. This channel collected water from the mountains and distributed it across the plain through a network of smaller canals. The canal system divided the plain into a grid of rectangular sections. Each section was about 100 stadia on a side, creating a checkerboard pattern across the landscape. These sections were assigned to different communities, each responsible for providing soldiers and resources for the common defence. The mountains that surrounded the plain were described as the most numerous, largest, and most beautiful in the world. They sheltered the plain from cold northern winds and provided timber, minerals, and other resources. Villages and towns dotted the mountain slopes, and rivers flowed down from the heights to water the plain below. The entire island was blessed with abundant natural resources. Forests provided timber for ships and buildings. Mines yielded metals of all kinds, including the mysterious orichalcum. The soil produced crops in abundance, and the pastures supported herds of cattle and other livestock. Even elephants roamed the island, providing ivory and serving as beasts of burden. The architecture of Atlantis was magnificent. The Atlanteans built with stone of different colours, quarried from beneath the central island and from the shores of the rings of land. They used white stone, black stone, and red stone, arranging them in patterns that pleased the eye. The walls of the city gleamed with these colours, creating a striking visual effect that could be seen from far out at sea. The outer wall of the city, which surrounded the outermost ring of land, was coated with brass. Brass is an alloy of copper and zinc, and it would have gleamed golden in the sunlight. This wall protected the commercial and industrial districts of the city from attack. The next wall inward, surrounding the second ring of land, was coated with tin. Tin has a silvery appearance, providing a contrast with the brass of the outer wall. This wall protected the temples and gardens of the middle zone. The innermost wall surrounding the central island itself was coated with orichalcum. This mysterious metal, which we will discuss in detail later, was said to sparkle like fire. It was the most precious substance known to the Atlanteans, and they used it to adorn their most sacred spaces. The palace complex on the central island was a marvel of architecture. Generation after generation of kings added to it, each one trying to surpass his predecessors in magnificence. The result was a sprawling complex of buildings, courtyards, gardens, and sacred spaces that defied description. At the heart of the palace stood the Temple of Poseidon, the most sacred building in all of Atlantis. We will describe this temple in detail when we discuss the religion of the Atlanteans. For now, let us simply note that it was the spiritual centre of the civilization, the place where the kings gathered to make their most solemn decisions and perform their most sacred rituals. The palace also contained private quarters for the royal family, halls for feasting and ceremony, treasuries filled with wealth from across the known world, and gardens where rare plants bloomed in every season. Underground passages connected different parts of the complex, allowing the kings to move about unseen when they wished. The hot and cold springs that Poseidon had created were channeled throughout the palace and the central island. Baths of various temperatures were available for the royal family and their guests. Some baths were open to the sky, surrounded by gardens and fountains. Others were enclosed, providing privacy and shelter from the weather. The Atlanteans also created baths for their horses and other animals. This detail suggests a civilization that valued its livestock and understood the importance of animal husbandry. Horses were essential for war and transportation, and keeping them healthy and clean would have been a priority. Outside the palace, on the rings of land, the Atlanteans built temples to various gods, gardens for relaxation and exercise, and facilities for athletic training. The Greeks placed great value on physical fitness, and Plato attributes similar values to the Atlanteans. Running tracks, wrestling grounds, and spaces for other sports were available for citizens to use. The overall impression is of a city designed for both beauty and function. The concentric rings provided natural defences while also creating distinct zones for different activities. The canal system allowed ships to penetrate deep into the heart of the city, while also providing water for irrigation and sanitation. The colourful walls and magnificent buildings demonstrated the wealth and sophistication of the civilization. This was the physical setting for the remarkable culture that developed on Atlantis, a city of rings and bridges, of canals and harbours, of gleaming walls and sacred temples, a city blessed by the gods and enhanced by human ingenuity, a city that, for all its magnificence, was destined to vanish beneath the waves, leaving nothing but memory and legend behind. Every great civilization has an origin story, a tale of how it came to be and why it is special. For Atlantis, that story begins with the gods themselves, with a division of the world among the immortals and a love affair between a god and a mortal woman. In the beginning, according to Greek mythology, the gods divided the earth among themselves by lot. Each deity received a portion of the world to rule and protect. Athena, the goddess of wisdom, received the land that would become Athens, and Poseidon, the mighty god of the sea, received the island of Atlantis. Poseidon was one of the most powerful gods in the Greek pantheon. He was the brother of Zeus, king of the gods, and Hades, lord of the underworld. Together, these three brothers had overthrown their father Cronus and divided the universe among themselves. Zeus took the sky, Hades took the underworld, and Poseidon took the sea. But Poseidon's domain extended beyond the ocean itself. He was also the god of earthquakes, known by the epithet Earthshaker. He could cause the ground to tremble with a blow of his mighty trident. He was associated with horses, which he was said to have created, and with bulls, which were sacred to him. These associations would all prove significant in the story of Atlantis. When Poseidon received Atlantis as his portion, the island was already inhabited. On the central hill lived a man named Evenor and his wife Leucippe. They had a daughter named Cleito, who was just coming into the flower of womanhood when her parents died, leaving her alone on the hill. Poseidon saw Cleito and was filled with desire for her. The gods of Greek mythology were not distant or abstract beings. They had passions and desires much like mortals, and they frequently involved themselves in human affairs, for good or ill. Poseidon's desire for Cleito would shape the destiny of an entire civilization. The god came to Cleito and made her his consort. To protect her and to create a suitable dwelling for their union, he reshaped the landscape around her hill. He carved the alternating rings of sea and land that would become the defining feature of Atlantis. He made the central island inaccessible to ordinary mortals, a sanctuary where he could visit his beloved without interference. Poseidon also provided the island with everything Cleito could need. He caused hot and cold springs to flow from the earth, providing water for drinking and bathing. He made the soil fertile so that crops would grow in abundance. He filled the surrounding waters with fish and other sea creatures. The island became a paradise, a gift of love from a god to a mortal woman. Cleito bore Poseidon 5 pairs of twin sons, 10 boys in all. These 10 princes would become the founders of the 10 kingdoms of Atlantis, the ancestors of all the royal houses that would rule the island for countless generations. The firstborn of the eldest pair was named Atlas. This name would give the island its name, Atlantis, and would also be given to the ocean that surrounded it, the Atlantic. Atlas received the central portion of the island, including the hill where his mother lived and the surrounding rings of land and water. He became the first king of Atlantis, and his descendants would always hold precedence over the other royal houses. Atlas's twin brother was named Gadyrus, or in the Greek form, Eumelus. He received the portion of the island nearest to the Pillars of Heracles, the region facing the land that in Plato's time was called Gadira. This is modern Cadiz in Spain, and some researchers have seen in this detail evidence that Plato was drawing on real geographical knowledge. The other 8 brothers received portions of the island as well, each becoming the founder of a royal dynasty. Their names were Ampheres and Evemon, Meneceus and Autochthon, Elasippus and Mestor, and Azias and Diaprepes. Each name was passed down through generations, as sons were named after their illustrious ancestors. The 10 kingdoms of Atlantis were united under the overall sovereignty of the House of Atlas. The king who sat on the central island was the High King, with authority over all the others. But each of the 10 kingdoms had its own king, its own territory, and its own traditions. They were bound together by blood, by law, and by sacred oaths, but they retained a degree of independence in their own domains. This political structure, with a high king presiding over subordinate kings, was familiar in the ancient world. It resembled the organization of many ancient empires, where local rulers acknowledged the supremacy of a central authority while maintaining control over their own territories. Plato may have been drawing on his knowledge of Persian or Egyptian political organization when he described the Atlantean system. The divine origin of the Atlantean royal houses gave them a special status. They were not merely human rulers, but descendants of a god. The blood of Poseidon flowed in their veins, giving them a connection to the divine that ordinary mortals lacked. This divine ancestry was the source of their authority and the foundation of their legitimacy. For many generations, the divine blood remained strong in the Atlantean kings. They possessed virtues that seemed more than human. They were wise in judgment, brave in battle, and just in their dealings with their subjects. They were not corrupted by the enormous wealth that surrounded them, nor made arrogant by the vast power they wielded. They understood that their gifts came from the gods, and that they were stewards rather than owners of their realm. Plato emphasizes this point because it is central to his philosophical message. The early Atlanteans were virtuous because they were close to the divine. They valued wisdom and goodness more than material wealth. They treated each other with respect and governed their subjects with justice. This is the ideal that Plato holds up for admiration, the standard against which the later corruption of Atlantis will be measured. The story of Poseidon and Cleito also establishes the special relationship between Atlantis and the sea. As the domain of the sea god, Atlantis was naturally oriented toward maritime activities. The Atlanteans became master sailors and shipbuilders. They dominated the waters around their island and eventually extended their influence across the Atlantic and into the Mediterranean. The presence of Poseidon also explains some of the physical features of Atlantis. The hot springs that bubbled up from the earth could be seen as gifts from the god, or as signs of his presence beneath the island. The earthquakes that would eventually destroy Atlantis were within Poseidon's power to cause or prevent. The very landscape of the island, with its rings of water and land, was shaped by the god's hand. Bulls, which were sacred to Poseidon, played an important role in Atlantean religion. We will discuss the bull sacrifice in detail later, but for now, we can note that this practice connected the Atlanteans to their divine patron. By honouring the bull, they honoured Poseidon. By shedding the bull's blood, they renewed their covenant with the god who had founded their civilization. The divine origins of Atlantis also raise questions about the relationship between gods and mortals. The children of Poseidon and Cleito were half divine, possessing qualities that set them apart from ordinary humans. But as generations passed and the divine blood was diluted through marriage with mortals, these special qualities faded. The Atlanteans became more human and less divine, more susceptible to the weaknesses and temptations that afflict ordinary mortals. This gradual dilution of divine blood is a key element in Plato's narrative. It explains how a civilization that began in virtue and wisdom could eventually fall into corruption and vice. The Atlanteans did not suddenly become evil. They slowly lost touch with their divine heritage, and as they did, they lost the virtues that had made their civilization great. The story of Poseidon and Cleito is also a love story, though one with the power imbalance typical of Greek myths about gods and mortals. Cleito had little choice in the matter when a god decided to make her his consort, but within the terms of the myth, Poseidon's actions are presented as benevolent. He protects Cleito, provides for her needs, and creates a paradise for her to inhabit. Their union produces a royal dynasty that will rule for countless generations. This divine foundation gave the Atlantean civilization a sense of destiny and purpose. They were not just another nation among nations. They were the chosen people of Poseidon, blessed by the god of the sea and entrusted with dominion over the Atlantic world. This sense of special status would sustain them through centuries of growth and achievement, but it would also, eventually, contribute to their downfall, as they came to believe that they deserved their power rather than recognizing it as a gift from the gods. The political organization of Atlantis was as remarkable as its physical layout. 10 kingdoms, each ruled by a descendant of Poseidon, united under the sovereignty of the House of Atlas. This system combined the benefits of local autonomy with the strength of central authority, creating a political structure that endured for countless generations. Each of the 10 kings had absolute authority within his own domain. He could make laws, administer justice, and command the resources of his kingdom as he saw fit. The people of each kingdom owed allegiance to their own king first and to the High King second. This arrangement allowed for diversity and local adaptation while maintaining the unity of the Atlantean civilization. The High King, always a descendant of Atlas, held supreme authority over the entire island and its overseas possessions. He could call upon the other kings to provide soldiers and ships for common enterprises. He arbitrated disputes between the kingdoms and represented Atlantis in dealings with foreign powers. His word was final in matters affecting the whole civilization, but the power of the High King was not unlimited. He was bound by ancient laws that had been established by Poseidon himself at the founding of the civilization. These laws were inscribed on a pillar of orichalcum that stood in the temple of Poseidon at the centre of the island. No king, not even the High King, could violate these sacred laws without risking the anger of the gods. The laws inscribed on the pillar governed the relationships among the 10 kings. They specified that the kings should not take up arms against one another. If any king attempted to overthrow another, the remaining kings were obligated to come to the defence of the one attacked. This provision ensured internal peace and prevented the kind of civil wars that plagued many ancient civilizations. The laws also specified that the kings should deliberate together on matters of common concern. No major decision affecting the whole civilization could be made by the High King alone. He was required to consult with his fellow kings and to seek their agreement before taking action. This provision ensured that the voices of all the royal houses were heard, and that power did not become too concentrated in the hands of one ruler. The most important provision of the sacred laws concerned the descendants of Atlas. The High King was forbidden from putting any of his kinsmen to death unless the majority of the 10 kings agreed. This protection ensured that the royal house of Atlas could not be destroyed by a single tyrannical ruler. It also gave the other kings a check on the power of the High King, since they could refuse to sanction executions that seemed unjust. To renew their commitment to these laws and to each other, the 10 kings gathered every 5th year, alternating with gatherings every 6th year. This schedule, based on odd and even numbers, had symbolic significance in Greek thought. The Pythagoreans, whom Plato admired, attached great importance to the properties of numbers, and the alternating pattern may reflect this influence. The gathering of the kings was a solemn and sacred occasion. It took place in the temple of Poseidon, at the very heart of Atlantis. The kings came together to deliberate on the affairs of the realm, to judge any who had violated the laws, and to renew their oaths of loyalty to each other and to the gods. The ceremony that accompanied these gatherings was elaborate and impressive. It began with a ritual that connected the kings to their divine ancestor and to the sacred bulls that were associated with Poseidon. This ritual, which we will describe in detail in the next section, was the most solemn religious observance in the Atlantean calendar. After the ritual, the kings would deliberate on matters of state. They sat in judgment on any cases that had been brought before them, applying the laws inscribed on the sacred pillar. They discussed matters of war and peace, trade and diplomacy, religion and public works. They made decisions that would affect the lives of millions of people across the Atlantean Empire. The decisions of the kings were recorded and preserved. Atlantis, like other advanced civilizations, must have had a system of writing and record-keeping, though Plato does not describe it in detail. The laws, treaties, and judgments of the kings would have been written down and stored in archives, creating a continuous record of Atlantean governance. The political system of Atlantis reflected Plato's own ideas about government. In his philosophical works, Plato argued that the best form of government was rule by the wise, by philosopher kings who understood the true nature of justice and goodness. The early Atlantean kings, with their divine ancestry and their commitment to virtue, approximated this ideal. Plato also believed in the importance of law. A good society, in his view, was one governed by just laws that applied equally to all citizens. The sacred laws of Atlantis, inscribed on the orichalcum pillar and binding on all the kings, embodied this principle. Even the most powerful rulers were subject to these laws and could be judged by their peers if they violated them. The balance between central authority and local autonomy in Atlantis also reflected Plato's political thought. He recognized that large states needed strong central government to maintain unity and defend against external threats. But he also understood the dangers of excessive centralization, which could lead to tyranny and oppression. The Atlantean system, with its 10 semi-independent kingdoms united under a high king, struck a balance between these competing concerns. The longevity of the Atlantean political system was remarkable. For countless generations, the 10 kingdoms maintained their unity and their commitment to the sacred laws. Kings came and went, but the system endured. This stability was one of the foundations of Atlantean greatness, allowing the civilization to develop and prosper over many centuries. But no political system lasts forever. As the divine blood of the Atlantean kings became diluted over time, their commitment to virtue weakened. The sacred laws that had bound them together began to seem like inconvenient restrictions rather than wise guidelines. The harmony among the kingdoms gave way to rivalry and suspicion, and eventually the political system that had served Atlantis so well would prove unable to prevent its downfall. The government of Atlantis also extended beyond the island itself. As the Atlantean Empire grew, it came to include territories in Europe and Africa. These conquered lands were governed by Atlantean officials or by local rulers who acknowledged Atlantean supremacy. The administrative challenges of managing such a vast empire must have been enormous, requiring sophisticated systems of communication, taxation, and military control. Plato does not provide details about how the overseas empire was governed. His focus is on the island of Atlantis itself and on the 10 kings who ruled it. But we can infer that the Atlanteans must have developed effective methods of imperial administration, since they maintained control over vast territories for extended periods. The political achievements of Atlantis were impressive by any standard. The Atlanteans created a system of government that combined stability with flexibility, central authority with local autonomy, divine sanction with practical wisdom. For many generations, this system worked remarkably well, allowing the civilization to flourish and expand. Its eventual failure was not due to any inherent flaw in the system itself, but to the moral decline of the people who operated it. Religion was at the heart of Atlantean civilization. The Atlanteans worshipped Poseidon as their patron deity and founder, and they built magnificent temples in his honor. Their religious practices connected them to their divine origins and reinforced the bonds that held their society together. The most important religious site in Atlantis was the Temple of Poseidon on the central island. This temple was a marvel of architecture and craftsmanship, reflecting the wealth and devotion of the Atlantean people. Plato describes it in considerable detail, giving us a vivid picture of its magnificence. The temple was 1 stadion in length and 300 feet in width, proportions that made it one of the largest religious buildings in the ancient world. Its exterior was covered with silver, except for the pinnacles, which were covered with gold. The gleaming surfaces would have been visible from far away, a beacon of divine presence at the heart of the civilization. Inside the temple, the ceiling was made of ivory, decorated with gold, silver, and orichalcum. The effect must have been breathtaking, a canopy of precious materials glowing in the light of torches and oil lamps. The walls, pillars, and floors were all covered with orichalcum, that mysterious metal that sparkled like fire. At the centre of the temple stood a colossal statue of Poseidon. The god was depicted standing in a chariot drawn by 6 winged horses. The chariot was so large that Poseidon's head nearly touched the ceiling. Around the chariot, 100 Nereids rode on dolphins. The Nereids were sea nymphs, minor goddesses associated with Poseidon, and their presence in the temple emphasized the maritime nature of Atlantean religion. This statue of Poseidon was one of the wonders of the ancient world, at least in Plato's telling. It combined enormous scale with intricate detail, creating an image of divine power and majesty that would have awed all who beheld it. The use of gold, silver, and orichalcum gave it a brilliance that ordinary stone could never achieve. Outside the temple, golden statues of the 10 original kings and their wives stood in a sacred precinct. These statues honoured the founders of the royal houses and reminded visitors of the divine origins of Atlantean royalty. Other offerings from the kings and from private citizens accumulated over the centuries, filling the temple grounds with treasures from across the known world. The temple precinct also contained altars, where sacrifices were offered to Poseidon. The smoke of burning offerings rose constantly into the sky, carrying the prayers of the faithful to the god who watched over them. Priests tended the sacred fires and performed the daily rituals that maintained the connection between the mortal and divine realms. But the most important religious ceremony in Atlantis was not a daily ritual. It was the gathering of the 10 kings that took place every 5 or 6 years. This ceremony combined political deliberation with sacred observance, renewing the bonds among the royal houses and reaffirming their commitment to the laws of Poseidon. The ceremony began at nightfall. The 10 kings assembled in the temple of Poseidon, wearing dark blue robes that symbolized the sea over which their ancestor ruled. No servants or attendants were present. The kings performed the sacred rites themselves, without intermediaries, as their ancestors had done since the founding of the civilization. In the temple precinct, sacred bulls roamed freely. These bulls were dedicated to Poseidon and were allowed to live without constraint, grazing on the temple grounds and drinking from the sacred springs. They were magnificent animals, powerful and wild, embodying the strength and majesty of the god they served. The first task of the kings was to capture one of these bulls. Armed only with staves and nooses, without any weapons of metal, the 10 rulers hunted the sacred animal through the temple grounds. This was no easy task. The bulls were strong and dangerous, and capturing one required skill, courage, and cooperation among the kings. The restriction against metal weapons was significant. It connected the ritual to an earlier age, before the development of bronze and iron tools. It also ensured that the kings relied on their own strength and cunning, rather than on technological advantages. The hunt was a test of virtue as well as ability. When a bull was captured, it was led to the pillar of orichalcum, where the sacred laws were inscribed. There, in the presence of the laws and under the gaze of Poseidon, the bull was sacrificed. Its throat was cut so that the blood flowed over the inscribed laws, consecrating them anew with each ceremony. After the sacrifice, the kings burned the limbs of the bull as an offering to Poseidon. The smoke rose toward the heavens, carrying the essence of the sacrifice to the god. The remainder of the bull was prepared for a sacred meal that the kings would share later in the ceremony. But first came the most solemn part of the ritual. Each king took a golden cup and dipped it into the bowl where the bull's blood had been collected. They mixed the blood with wine and poured libations over the fire, swearing oaths to judge according to the laws inscribed on the pillar and to punish anyone who had violated them. The oaths were specific and binding. Each king swore not to rule except in accordance with the ancient laws. He swore not to disobey the commands of his father, meaning the High King descended from Atlas. He swore that if any of his fellow kings violated the laws, he would join in punishing the offender. And he swore that he himself would submit to punishment if he was found guilty of wrongdoing. After swearing these oaths, each king drank from his golden cup, consuming the mixture of blood and wine. This act bound him physically, as well as spiritually, to his promises. The blood of the sacred bull dedicated to Poseidon now flowed through his veins, connecting him to the god and to his fellow kings. The cups were then dedicated in the temple, added to the collection of sacred vessels that had accumulated over countless generations. Each cup was inscribed with the name of the king who had used it and the date of the ceremony, creating a permanent record of the oaths that had been sworn. When the ritual was complete, the kings changed from their dark robes into garments of the most beautiful azure blue. As darkness fell completely over the island, they sat in judgment on any matters that required their attention. They examined accusations that had been brought against any of their number and determined appropriate punishments for any violations of the sacred laws. The judgments rendered during these nighttime sessions were inscribed on tablets of gold. When dawn approached, the kings wrote their decisions on these tablets and dedicated them along with their robes as memorials of the proceedings. These golden records preserved the judicial decisions of the kings for future generations to study and follow. After the formal business was concluded, the kings shared a sacred meal together. They ate the flesh of the sacrificed bull, consuming the animal that had sealed their oaths. This communal meal reinforced the bonds of brotherhood among the rulers and symbolized their shared commitment to the welfare of Atlantis. The religious ceremonies of Atlantis served multiple purposes. They honored Poseidon, the divine founder and protector of the civilization. They renewed the bonds among the 10 royal houses, preventing the rivalries and conflicts that might otherwise tear the empire apart. They reaffirmed the sacred laws that governed Atlantean society, and they reminded the kings of their responsibilities and their accountability to powers greater than themselves. The bull sacrifice was particularly significant. Bulls were sacred to Poseidon throughout the Greek world, and their sacrifice was one of the highest honours that could be offered to the god. The blood of the bull, flowing over the inscribed laws, connected the divine and human realms. The consumption of blood and wine by the kings made them participants in the divine mystery, not merely observers. The restriction of the ceremony to the 10 kings, without priests or servants, emphasized the special status of the royal houses. They were not ordinary mortals who needed intermediaries to approach the divine. They were descendants of Poseidon himself, and they could communicate with their ancestor directly through the sacred rituals. The timing of the ceremony, at night and extending until dawn, gave it an atmosphere of mystery and solemnity. The darkness hid the proceedings from ordinary eyes, making them secret and sacred. The transition from night to day symbolized the renewal that the ceremony accomplished, the fresh start that each gathering provided for the relationships among the kings. Beyond the great ceremony of the kings, the Atlanteans practiced many other forms of religious observance. They offered daily sacrifices at temples throughout the island. They celebrated festivals marking the seasons and commemorating important events in their history. They consulted oracles and sought guidance from the gods through various forms of divination. The priests of Atlantis formed a distinct class within society. They were responsible for maintaining the temples, performing the daily rituals, and preserving the religious traditions of the civilization. They possessed knowledge that was not available to ordinary citizens, including the proper forms of prayer and sacrifice, the meanings of omens and portents, and the stories of the gods and heroes. The religious life of ordinary Atlanteans would have centered on local temples and shrines. While the great temple of Poseidon on the central island was the spiritual heart of the civilization, most people would never have seen it. They worshipped at smaller temples in their own communities, offering prayers and sacrifices for health, prosperity, and protection. The Atlanteans probably worshipped other gods besides Poseidon. The Greek pantheon included many deities, each with their own spheres of influence and their own cults. Athena, Apollo, Artemis, Demeter, and the other Olympians would likely have had temples and followers in Atlantis, even if Poseidon remained supreme. Religion also shaped the moral values of Atlantean society. The laws inscribed on the orichalcum pillar were not merely political regulations, but divine commandments. Violating them was not just a crime against the state, but a sin against Poseidon. This gave the laws a weight and authority that purely human legislation could never possess. The connection between religion and morality would prove crucial in the story of Atlantis. As long as the Atlanteans remained faithful to their religious traditions, they maintained the virtues that made their civilization great. But when they began to neglect the gods and forget their divine origins, their moral character declined. The religious dimension of the Atlantean story is inseparable from its political and ethical dimensions. The wealth of Atlantis was legendary. Plato describes an island blessed with natural abundance and enriched by human industry, a land where every good thing was available in quantities that seemed almost miraculous. This wealth was both a blessing and eventually a curse for the Atlantean civilization. The most famous resource of Atlantis was orichalcum. This mysterious metal was found only on the island, and it was considered the most precious substance in the world after gold. Plato tells us that orichalcum sparkled like fire, suggesting a reddish or golden colour with an unusual brilliance. The exact nature of orichalcum has been debated for centuries. Some scholars believe it was a real metal, perhaps a copper alloy similar to brass or bronze. Others think it was a mythical substance invented by Plato to enhance the wonder of his story. Still others have suggested that orichalcum might have been amber, which has a fiery colour and was highly valued in the ancient world. Whatever its true nature, orichalcum played a central role in Atlantean culture. It was used to coat the walls of the innermost citadel, surrounding the palace and temple with a ring of fire-like brilliance. The sacred pillar where the laws were inscribed was made of orichalcum. The floors and walls of the temple of Poseidon gleamed with it. Orichalcum was the signature material of Atlantean civilization, a symbol of its unique wealth and power. Beyond orichalcum, Atlantis possessed abundant deposits of other metals. Gold, silver, copper and tin were all available in quantities sufficient to meet the needs of the civilization. The Atlanteans were skilled metalworkers, crafting beautiful objects from these materials and using them in construction, commerce and warfare. The forests of Atlantis provided timber for ships and buildings. The island was covered with trees of every kind, including varieties that produced fragrant resins and oils. These forests supported a thriving lumber industry and provided raw materials for the shipyards that built the Atlantean navy. The soil of Atlantis was extraordinarily fertile. Crops grew in abundance, providing food for the large population and surpluses for trade. The great plain that stretched across the island was carefully cultivated, irrigated by the canal system that distributed water from the mountains. Wheat, barley, fruits, and vegetables all flourished in the favourable climate. The island also supported a remarkable variety of animals. Herds of cattle grazed on the pastures, providing meat, milk, and leather. Horses were bred for war and transportation, and the Atlanteans were famous for their skill in horsemanship. Sheep and goats provided wool and additional food sources. Most remarkably, Plato tells us that elephants lived on Atlantis. These mighty animals roamed the forests and plains, providing ivory for trade and craftsmanship. The presence of elephants suggests a connection to Africa, where these animals were common, and has led some researchers to look for Atlantis in regions where elephants might plausibly have lived. The seas around Atlantis teemed with fish and other marine life. Fishing was an important industry, and the harbours were filled with boats bringing in the daily catch. The Atlanteans also harvested shellfish, including the murex snails that produced the precious purple dye valued throughout the ancient world. The combination of natural resources and human industry made Atlantis fabulously wealthy. The kings lived in palaces of unimaginable splendour, surrounded by treasures accumulated over generations. The temples overflowed with offerings of gold and silver. Even ordinary citizens enjoyed a standard of living that would have seemed luxurious to people in other lands. Trade was a major source of Atlantean wealth. Ships from the island carried goods to ports throughout the Atlantic and Mediterranean worlds. They brought back exotic products from distant lands, spices and silks, precious stones and rare woods, slaves and animals. The harbours of Atlantis were crowded with vessels from many nations, creating a cosmopolitan atmosphere of commerce and exchange. The canal system that connected the rings of water to the sea facilitated this trade. Ships could sail directly into the heart of the city, loading and unloading cargo at docks that lined the circular harbours. Warehouses stored goods awaiting shipment or distribution. Merchants negotiated deals in the marketplaces that surrounded the harbours. The daily life of ordinary Atlanteans would have varied depending on their social position and occupation. Farmers worked the fertile plains, planting and harvesting crops according to the seasons. Craftsmen produced the goods that filled the markets: pottery and textiles, metalwork and woodwork, jewellery and furniture. Sailors manned the ships that carried Atlantean trade across the seas. Soldiers trained for war and stood ready to defend the realm. The cities of Atlantis were centres of culture as well as commerce. Temples provided spaces for religious observance and community gathering. Public buildings housed the administration of the state. Markets and shops offered goods from across the known world. Streets and squares bustled with activity as people went about their daily business. Entertainment and leisure were also part of Atlantean life. The Greeks valued athletic competition, and Plato attributes similar values to the Atlanteans. Running tracks, wrestling grounds, and other sports facilities were available for citizens to use. Festivals and celebrations marked important dates in the calendar, providing opportunities for feasting, music, and dance. The hot and cold springs that Poseidon had created were developed into elaborate bathing facilities. Public baths were available for citizens of all classes, providing not just cleanliness but also relaxation and social interaction. The Atlanteans understood the therapeutic value of bathing, and they created spaces where people could soak in warm mineral waters and refresh themselves in cool pools. Education would have been important in a civilization as sophisticated as Atlantis. The children of the elite would have received instruction in reading, writing, mathematics, and other subjects. They would have learned the history and traditions of their people, the stories of the gods and heroes, the laws and customs that governed society. Training in warfare would have been essential for young men of the noble classes. The family was probably the basic unit of Atlantean society, as it was in most ancient civilizations. Marriages would have been arranged to strengthen alliances and preserve wealth within family lines. Children were valued as heirs and as contributors to the family's labour and status. The elderly were respected for their wisdom and experience. Women in Atlantis would have had roles similar to those of women in other ancient societies. They managed households, raised children, and participated in religious observances. Elite women might have had more freedom and influence than common women, but all would have been subordinate to male authority in most aspects of public life. Slavery was probably practiced in Atlantis, as it was throughout the ancient world. Slaves would have performed much of the manual labour that supported the economy, working in fields, mines and workshops. They would have served in households, attending to the needs of their owners. The wealth of Atlantis may have depended in part on the labour of enslaved people. The legal system of Atlantis would have regulated daily life and resolved disputes. Beyond the sacred laws inscribed on the orichalcum pillar, which governed the relationships among the kings, there would have been ordinary laws covering property, contracts, crimes, and other matters. Courts would have heard cases and rendered judgments, maintaining order in society. The wealth of Atlantis created a civilization of remarkable achievement. The Atlanteans built magnificent structures, created beautiful works of art, and developed sophisticated systems of government and commerce. They enjoyed a standard of living that few ancient peoples could match. Their cities were marvels of planning and engineering. Their ships sailed to the ends of the earth, and their influence extended across vast territories. But wealth also carried dangers. As the Atlanteans became accustomed to abundance, they began to take it for granted. The virtues that had built their civilization, hard work, moderation, respect for the gods, gradually gave way to complacency and self-indulgence. The wealth that had been a blessing began to corrupt those who possessed it. Plato saw this pattern repeated throughout history. Civilizations rise through virtue and hard work, achieve prosperity and power, and then decline as success breeds arrogance and excess. The story of Atlantis is, in part, a cautionary tale about the dangers of wealth, a warning that material abundance can destroy the moral foundations on which it rests. The military power of Atlantis was as impressive as its wealth. Plato describes an army and navy of enormous size and sophistication, capable of projecting force across vast distances and conquering territories far from the homeland. This military might was the instrument through which Atlantis built its empire and threatened the Mediterranean world. The army of Atlantis was organized according to a system based on the division of the Great Plain. The plain was divided into 60,000 lots, each assigned to a leader responsible for providing soldiers and equipment. This system ensured a steady supply of military manpower and distributed the burden of defense across the population. Each lot was required to provide a specified contribution to the army. The basic unit was a chariot with 2 horses and a driver, accompanied by a mounted warrior, a light-armed soldier, and 2 heavy-armed soldiers. Each lot also provided 2 archers, 2 slingers, 3 stone shooters, and 3 javelin throwers. Finally, each lot contributed 4 sailors to man the ships of the navy. If we multiply these numbers by the 60,000 lots of the plain, we get an army of staggering size. The chariot force alone would have numbered 60,000 vehicles with 120,000 horses. The infantry would have included hundreds of thousands of soldiers of various types. And this was just a contribution from the Great Plain of the Central Island. The other 9 kingdoms of Atlantis also contributed to the military forces. Their contributions varied according to their size and resources, but together they added substantially to the total strength of the Atlantean military. When fully mobilized, the combined forces of the 10 kingdoms would have constituted one of the largest armies in the ancient world. The navy of Atlantis was equally impressive. The central kingdom alone maintained 1,200 warships manned by crews drawn from the population of the plain. These ships were housed in the great harbours created by the rings of water, ready to sail at the command of the king. The other 9 kingdoms also maintained naval forces, adding their ships to the total Atlantean fleet. When combined, the navy of Atlantis would have numbered thousands of vessels, capable of dominating any sea and transporting armies to distant shores. The warships of the ancient world were primarily galleys, propelled by oars and sometimes assisted by sails. They were designed for speed and maneuverability, able to ram enemy vessels or bring soldiers close enough to board. The Atlantean ships would have been among the finest of their era, built from the abundant timber of the island's forests and crewed by experienced sailors. The harbours of Atlantis were designed to support this massive navy. The rings of water provided sheltered anchorage for hundreds of ships, protected from storms and enemy attack. Shipyards lined the shores, where new vessels were built and damaged ones repaired. Warehouses stored the supplies needed for naval operations, rope and canvas, food and water, weapons and ammunition. The military organisation of Atlantis reflected a society geared for war. Every citizen had obligations to the defence of the realm. The wealthy provided horses, chariots, and equipment. The common people served as soldiers and sailors. The entire economy was structured to support the military machine that projected Atlantean power across the world. The training of Atlantean soldiers would have been rigorous and thorough. From childhood, young men would have learned the skills of warfare, how to ride horses, drive chariots, wield weapons, and fight in formation. Military exercises and competitions would have honed these skills and identified the most capable warriors for positions of leadership. The weapons of the Atlantean army would have included the full range of ancient military technology: swords, spears, and axes for close combat, bows, slings, and javelins for ranged attacks, shields and armor for protection, chariots for mobility and shock effect. The Atlanteans would have been masters of all these weapons, trained to use them effectively in various tactical situations. The chariot was a particularly important element of Atlantean warfare. Chariots had been a dominant force on ancient battlefields for centuries, providing speed, mobility, and psychological impact. A charge of thousands of chariots, with horses thundering and wheels rumbling, would have been terrifying to face. The Atlanteans, with their 60,000 chariots from the plain alone, could have fielded the largest chariot force in history. Cavalry would have complemented the chariots, providing additional mobility and flexibility. Mounted warriors could scout enemy positions, pursue fleeing enemies, and exploit gaps in enemy lines. The horses of Atlantis were renowned for their quality, and the Atlantean cavalry would have been among the finest in the ancient world. The infantry formed the backbone of the army. Heavy-armed soldiers, equipped with shields, helmets, and body armor, fought in close formation, presenting a wall of bronze to the enemy. Light-armed soldiers harassed the enemy with missiles and exploited opportunities created by the heavy infantry. The combination of different troop types gave Atlantean commanders tactical flexibility. Siege warfare would have been another Atlantean capability. Conquering fortified cities required specialized equipment and techniques: battering rams to break down walls, siege towers to scale them, tunnels to undermine them. The Atlanteans, with their engineering skills and abundant resources, would have been capable of conducting prolonged sieges against even the strongest fortifications. The navy was essential for projecting Atlantean power beyond the island. Ships could transport armies across the sea, landing them on foreign shores to conquer new territories. They could blockade enemy ports, cutting off trade and starving cities into submission. They could protect Atlantean commerce and attack enemy shipping. Command of the sea was the key to Atlantean expansion. Naval warfare in the ancient world was brutal and decisive. Ships rammed each other, trying to hole the enemy hull and send the vessel to the bottom. Soldiers fought hand-to-hand on the decks, trying to capture enemy ships or kill their crews. Fire was a constant danger, as burning missiles could turn a wooden ship into an inferno. The Atlantean navy, with its thousands of ships and experienced crews, would have been a formidable force in any naval engagement. The military power of Atlantis was not merely defensive. Plato tells us that the Atlanteans used their forces to build an empire that extended far beyond their island home. They conquered territories in Europe and Africa, bringing vast populations under their rule. Their ambitions eventually brought them into conflict with the peoples of the Eastern Mediterranean, including the ancestors of the Greeks. The empire of Atlantis stretched from the island itself across the Atlantic to the shores of the Mediterranean. In Europe, they controlled territory as far as Tyrrhenia, the region of Italy inhabited by the Etruscans. In Africa, they ruled as far as Egypt. These were enormous distances requiring sophisticated logistics and administration to maintain control. The conquered peoples of the Atlantean Empire would have been required to pay tribute and provide soldiers for Atlantean armies. Local rulers might have been left in place, governing on behalf of their Atlantean overlords, or they might have been replaced by Atlantean officials. The empire would have been a patchwork of different peoples and cultures, united only by Atlantean military power. Maintaining such an empire required constant military readiness. Rebellions had to be suppressed, borders defended, rivals intimidated. The military machine of Atlantis consumed enormous resources, men and money, food and equipment. But as long as the empire generated more wealth than it cost to maintain, the system could continue. The military power of Atlantis was a source of pride for its people. They saw themselves as the dominant force in the world, destined to rule over lesser peoples. Their armies had never been defeated. Their navy controlled the seas, and their empire continued to expand. This confidence would eventually shade into arrogance, as the Atlanteans came to believe that nothing could stop them. But there were limits to Atlantean power. The Mediterranean world contained peoples who would not submit easily to foreign domination. Among these were the ancestors of the Greeks, who lived in the region that would later become Athens. When the Atlanteans turned their ambitions eastward, they would encounter resistance that would ultimately prove their undoing. The story of Atlantis is not just about the island empire, it is also about the city that stood against it, the ancient Athens that Plato presents as a model of virtue and courage. Understanding this prehistoric Athens is essential to understanding the meaning of the Atlantis narrative. According to Plato, the Athens that existed 9,000 years before Solon was very different from the Athens of his own time. It was a city organized according to the principles that Plato himself advocated in the Republic, a society governed by wisdom and dedicated to virtue. This ancient Athens represented everything that Atlantis, in its later corruption, had abandoned. The Athens of this distant era was ruled by a class of guardians, warriors who dedicated their lives to the defense of the city. These guardians lived apart from the rest of the population on the slopes of the Acropolis in a community that held all things in common. They had no private property, no gold or silver, no luxuries that might distract them from their duty. The guardians were supported by the labour of the other citizens, farmers and craftsmen who provided the necessities of life. This arrangement freed the guardians to focus entirely on their military and political responsibilities. They trained constantly for war, maintaining the physical fitness and martial skills that would be needed when enemies threatened. The social organisation of ancient Athens resembled the ideal state described in the Republic. Society was divided into classes based on function, with each class performing the role for which it was best suited. The guardians protected the city, the producers provided material goods, and wisdom guided the whole. This was Plato's vision of a just society, one in which everyone contributed according to their abilities and received according to their needs. The territory of ancient Athens was larger than in Plato's time. The land was more fertile, the soil richer, the rainfall more abundant. The hills that in later times were bare and rocky were then covered with forests. Springs and streams flowed where in Plato's day there was only dry ground. The land could support a larger population and produce greater wealth. But the Athenians of this era were not corrupted by their prosperity. They valued virtue more than wealth, honour more than comfort. They lived simply, avoiding the luxury and excess that weakened other peoples. Their strength came not from gold and silver, but from the quality of their character and the discipline of their training. The women of ancient Athens were the equals of the men in virtue and education. They received the same training in warfare and gymnastics as the men, and they shared in the defence of the city. This detail is significant because Plato advocated for the equality of women in the Republic, arguing that gender should not determine one's role in society. Ancient Athens, as he presents it, embodied this principle. The religion of ancient Athens centred on Athena and Hephaestus, the goddess of wisdom and the god of craftsmanship. These deities were associated with the skills that the Athenians valued most, the wisdom to govern justly and the ability to create useful things. The Acropolis, which in later times would be crowned by the Parthenon, was already a sacred site dedicated to these gods. The government of ancient Athens was based on justice and law. The citizens participated in decision-making, but they were guided by the wisdom of their best members. There was no tyranny, no mob rule, no domination by wealth or birth. The city was governed according to principles that served the common good rather than private interests. This portrait of ancient Athens is clearly idealized. Plato is not describing a historical society, but an imaginary one, a model of what a city could be if it were organized according to philosophical principles. The ancient Athens of his narrative is the republic made real, a thought experiment given flesh and blood. The contrast between ancient Athens and Atlantis is central to Plato's purpose. Atlantis represents one path that civilization can take, the path of wealth, power, and eventual corruption. Athens represents another path, the path of virtue, wisdom, and enduring strength. The conflict between them is a conflict between two ways of life, two visions of what human society should be. When the Atlanteans turned their ambitions toward the eastern Mediterranean, they encountered a people who would not submit. The ancient Athenians, though far less numerous and wealthy than their enemies, possessed something that the Atlanteans had lost. They had virtue, the moral strength that comes from living according to just principles. The war between Atlantis and Athens was not just a military conflict, it was a test of two different civilizations, two different approaches to human life. Would wealth and power triumph over virtue and wisdom? Would the corrupt empire overwhelm the just city? The answer that Plato gives is clear, and it carries a message that resonates across the centuries. The ancient Athenians stood alone against the might of Atlantis. Their allies, intimidated by Atlantean power, fell away one by one. The other Greek cities submitted or were conquered. The Athenians faced the full force of the Atlantean military machine with only their own resources and their own courage. And they won. The small city defeated the great empire. Virtue triumphed over corruption. Wisdom proved stronger than wealth. The Atlantean invasion was thrown back, and the peoples who had been conquered were liberated. Ancient Athens achieved a victory that seemed impossible, a triumph of quality over quantity, of spirit over matter. This victory is the climax of Plato's narrative, the moment when the meaning of the story becomes clear. The Atlanteans, for all their power, had lost the qualities that truly matter. They had become slaves to their appetites, prisoners of their own success. The Athenians, living simply and virtuously, had preserved the strength that comes from self-mastery. In the end, that strength proved decisive. The story of ancient Athens and Atlantis is a parable about the sources of true power. Military might, economic wealth, and political dominion are impressive, but they are not enough. A civilization that loses its moral foundations will eventually fall, no matter how strong it appears. A civilization that maintains its virtue will endure, even against seemingly overwhelming odds. Plato wrote this story for his own contemporaries, the Athenians of the 4th century before the Common Era. They had seen their city rise to greatness and then fall into defeat and division. They had witnessed the corruption of democratic politics and the execution of Socrates. Plato wanted to remind them of what Athens could be, what it had been in the mythical past, and what it might become again if its citizens returned to virtue. The message is timeless. Every generation faces the choice between virtue and corruption, between wisdom and folly, between the hard path of self-discipline and the easy path of self-indulgence. The story of Atlantis and Athens reminds us that these choices matter, that they determine the fate of civilizations, and that the consequences of our decisions may extend far beyond our own lifetimes. The war between Atlantis and the Mediterranean world was the defining conflict of its age. It pitted the greatest empire the world had ever seen against the peoples of the Eastern Mediterranean, culminating in a confrontation between Atlantean might and Athenian virtue. The outcome would shape the course of history, though not in the way anyone expected. The Atlantean Empire had been expanding for generations. From their island base in the Atlantic, the Atlanteans had conquered territories on both sides of the ocean. They controlled parts of Europe and Africa, bringing diverse peoples under their rule. Their wealth grew with each conquest, and their ambitions grew with their wealth. Eventually, the Atlanteans turned their attention to the Eastern Mediterranean. This region was home to ancient civilizations, Egypt and the kingdoms of the Near East, the islands of the Aegean and the cities of Greece. These lands were wealthy and cultured, prizes worthy of the greatest empire in the world. The Atlantean invasion began with overwhelming force. Their armies crossed from their territories in Western Europe and North Africa, advancing toward the heart of the Mediterranean world. Their navy controlled the sea lanes, cutting off trade and isolating the defenders. City after city fell before the Atlantean advance. The peoples of the Mediterranean were divided and unprepared. Some submitted without resistance, hoping to preserve their lives and property by accepting Atlantean rule. Others fought but were overwhelmed by the superior numbers and resources of the invaders. Alliances formed and dissolved as the military situation changed. Fear and confusion spread throughout the region. The Atlanteans conquered Libya as far as Egypt. They swept through Europe as far as Tyrrhenia. The ancient civilizations of the Mediterranean seemed on the verge of extinction, about to be absorbed into the vast Atlantean Empire. Only a few holdouts remained, small states that refused to submit despite the hopelessness of their situation. Among these holdouts was Athens. The Athenians had watched the Atlantean advance with growing alarm. They had seen their neighbours conquered, their allies defeated, their world transformed by the relentless expansion of the Western Empire. They knew that their turn would come, that the Atlanteans would not rest until they had conquered everything. When the Atlanteans finally turned their full attention to Greece, the Athenians faced a terrible choice. They could submit, as so many others had done, and hope for mercy from their conquerors. Or they could fight, knowing that defeat would mean destruction, but believing that some things were worth dying for. The Athenians chose to fight. They rallied the remaining Greek states, forming an alliance to resist the invasion. But one by one, their allies fell away. Some were conquered by the Atlanteans, others lost heart and surrendered. In the end, the Athenians stood alone, the last barrier between the Atlantean Empire and total domination of the Mediterranean world. The odds against Athens were overwhelming. The Atlantean army numbered in the hundreds of thousands, supported by a navy of thousands of ships. The Athenians had only the forces of a single city, a few thousand warriors at most. By any rational calculation, their resistance was hopeless. But the Athenians had something that the Atlanteans lacked. They had virtue. They had courage. They had the strength that comes from fighting for something greater than oneself. They believed in their cause, in their gods, in their way of life, and that belief gave them power that no mere numbers could match. The details of the war are not provided by Plato. He does not describe specific battles or name individual heroes. He tells us only the outcome, that Athens stood alone against Atlantis and emerged victorious. The greatest empire in the world was defeated by a single city, and the peoples who had been conquered were liberated. This victory was a triumph of spirit over matter, of quality over quantity. The Atlanteans had more soldiers, more ships, more resources of every kind. But the Athenians had better soldiers, better leaders, better reasons to fight. In the end, these intangible factors proved decisive. The war demonstrated a truth that Plato believed deeply. Material power is not the only kind of power, and it is not the most important kind. A society that cultivates virtue, that trains its citizens in courage and wisdom, that maintains its moral foundations, will be stronger than a society that relies on wealth and numbers alone. The Atlanteans had forgotten this truth, and their forgetfulness cost them everything. The victory of Athens was not just a military achievement, it was a moral victory, a vindication of the principles that the Athenians lived by. They had proven that virtue matters, that courage and wisdom can overcome seemingly impossible odds. Their example would inspire future generations, even if the specific details of their triumph were lost to time. The liberation of the conquered peoples was another consequence of the Athenian victory. Those who had submitted to Atlantean rule were freed from their bondage. Those who had been forced to serve in Atlantean armies returned to their homes. The Mediterranean world, which had seemed destined for permanent subjugation, was restored to freedom. But the aftermath of the war brought unexpected developments. The Atlanteans had been defeated, but they had not been destroyed. They still possessed their island homeland, their wealth, their military forces. They might have regrouped and renewed their assault on the Mediterranean world. They might have learned from their defeat and returned stronger than before. This possibility was never realized. Before the Atlanteans could recover from their defeat, before they could rebuild their forces and resume their conquests, catastrophe struck. The gods, who had watched the corruption of Atlantis with growing displeasure, decided that the time for judgment had come. The destruction of Atlantis was swift and total. In a single day and night of terrible violence, the entire island was swallowed by the sea. Earthquakes shattered the land. Floods swept away everything that had been built over countless generations. The magnificent temples, the gleaming palaces, the busy harbours, all vanished beneath the waves. But Athens did not escape unscathed. The same catastrophe that destroyed Atlantis also devastated the Greek world. The army that had defeated the Atlanteans was swallowed up by the earth. The civilization that had achieved such a remarkable victory was itself destroyed. The memory of ancient Athens, like the memory of Atlantis, was lost to subsequent generations. This double destruction is a sobering element of Plato's narrative. The virtuous do not always escape the fate of the wicked. Natural catastrophes do not discriminate between good and evil. The Athenians, for all their virtue, perished alongside their enemies. Their victory, though real, did not save them from the universal destruction that followed. The loss of both civilizations explains why the story was forgotten in Greece. The catastrophe wiped out the people who had lived through these events and destroyed the records that might have preserved their memory. Only in Egypt, protected by its geography from the worst effects of the disaster, did any account survive. And even there, the story was preserved only in the archives of the priests, unknown to the wider world until Solon's visit. The war between Atlantis and Athens thus ends not with triumph, but with tragedy. Both civilizations are destroyed, both memories are lost, and the world must begin again from a lower level. The cycle of rise and fall, which Plato saw as the pattern of human history, claims both the corrupt and the virtuous, both the aggressors and the defenders. Yet the story is not entirely without hope. The fact that we know about these events at all suggests that something survives. The wisdom of Egypt preserved the memory. Solon carried it back to Greece. Plato wrote it down for future generations. The story itself is a kind of victory over time and destruction, a testament to the human desire to remember and to learn. The war between Atlantis and Athens carries lessons that transcend its specific circumstances. It teaches us about the sources of true strength, the dangers of corruption, the importance of virtue. It reminds us that great powers can fall, that small states can triumph, that the moral dimension of conflict is as important as the material dimension. These lessons were relevant in Plato's time, and they remain relevant today. The destruction of Atlantis was not simply a natural disaster. It was divine punishment, the judgment of the gods upon a civilization that had lost its way. To understand why Atlantis was destroyed, we must understand how it fell from virtue into corruption. In the beginning, the Atlanteans were a noble people. The divine blood of Poseidon flowed strongly in their veins, giving them qualities that set them apart from ordinary mortals. They possessed wisdom to see what was truly valuable in life. They had temperance to control their desires. They showed courage in facing challenges. They practiced justice in their dealings with each other. These virtues were the foundation of Atlantean greatness. Because the Atlanteans were wise, they made good decisions. Because they were temperate, they were not distracted by excessive pleasures. Because they were courageous, they could overcome obstacles. Because they maintained harmony within their society. Their civilization flourished because they possessed the qualities that make flourishing possible. The wealth of Atlantis in those early days was seen in proper perspective. The Atlanteans understood that material goods were means, not ends. Gold and silver, palaces and temples, armies and navies, these were tools for living well, not substitutes for living well. The Atlanteans used their wealth wisely, neither hoarding it nor squandering it, but directing it toward worthy purposes. Plato describes this attitude with particular care. The early Atlanteans, he tells us, despised everything except virtue. They considered their prosperity to be of little account. They were not intoxicated by luxury or made unruly by wealth. They remained sober and clear-sighted, understanding that their good fortune could increase only through genuine friendship combined with virtue. This is a remarkable portrait of a wealthy society that has not been corrupted by its wealth. The Atlanteans had everything that most people desire: power, riches, comfort, pleasure. Yet they did not become slaves to these things. They maintained their freedom, their dignity, their moral compass. They proved that it is possible to be prosperous without being corrupted. But this happy state did not last forever. As generations passed, the divine element in the Atlantean bloodline became diluted. Each generation was a little more human, a little less divine than the one before. The qualities that had distinguished the Atlanteans from other peoples gradually faded, like a strong colour being mixed with more and more white until it becomes pale and weak. The change was slow and subtle at first. The Atlanteans did not suddenly become evil. They did not wake up one morning and decide to abandon virtue. The transformation happened gradually, almost imperceptibly, over many generations. Each small compromise, each minor deviation from the old standards, seemed insignificant by itself. But over time, these small changes accumulated into a fundamental transformation. The first signs of decline would have been barely noticeable. Perhaps the kings began to spend a little more time enjoying their luxuries and a little less time attending to their duties. Perhaps the citizens became a little more focused on acquiring wealth and a little less concerned with developing their characters. Perhaps the old religious observances were performed with a little less sincerity, a little more routine. As the divine element weakened, the human element grew stronger. And the human element, in Plato's view, was prone to certain characteristic failings. Humans are easily distracted by pleasure. They are tempted by power. They confuse appearance with reality, mistaking wealth for worth and status for substance. Without the divine perspective to guide them, humans tend to lose their way. The Atlanteans began to see their wealth differently. Instead of viewing it as a tool for living well, they began to see it as an end in itself. They wanted more, not because they needed more, but simply because having more seemed desirable. The moderation that had characterized their ancestors gave way to acquisitiveness and greed. They also began to see their power differently. Instead of viewing it as a responsibility to be exercised for the common good, they began to see it as a means of gratifying their desires. They used their military strength not to defend the innocent, but to conquer and exploit. They used their political authority not to promote justice, but to advance their own interests. The virtues that had made Atlantis great were replaced by their opposites. Wisdom gave way to foolishness, as the Atlanteans lost the ability to distinguish what was truly valuable from what merely seemed valuable. Temperance gave way to excess, as they indulged their appetites without restraint. Courage gave way to arrogance, as they confused recklessness with bravery. Justice gave way to selfishness, as they ceased to care about the welfare of others. Plato describes the corrupted Atlanteans in vivid terms. To those who had eyes to see, he says, they appeared base and ugly, having lost the fairest of their goods. But to those who could not perceive true happiness, they seemed glorious and blessed, filled as they were with lawless ambition and power. This observation cuts to the heart of Plato's philosophy. The corrupted Atlanteans were not obviously wicked. They did not think of themselves as evil. By the standards of the world, they were successful, powerful, enviable. They had everything that most people want. Only those with philosophical insight could see that they had lost what matters most. The corruption of Atlantis was a corruption of values. The Atlanteans came to value the wrong things. They valued wealth over wisdom, power over virtue, pleasure over goodness. They measured success by external standards rather than internal ones. They judged themselves and others by what they had rather than by what they were. This corruption affected every aspect of Atlantean society. The kings, who should have been examples of virtue, became examples of vice. The laws, which should have promoted justice, became instruments of oppression. The religion, which should have connected the people to the divine, became empty ritual. The military, which should have defended the innocent, became a tool of aggression. The corruption also affected relationships among the Atlanteans. Trust gave way to suspicion. Cooperation gave way to competition. The bonds of friendship and kinship weakened as each person pursued their own advantage. The harmony that had characterized early Atlantean society dissolved into conflict and rivalry. Even the physical beauty of Atlantis could not hide its moral ugliness. The temples still gleamed with gold and silver. The palaces still displayed magnificent architecture. The harbours still teemed with ships from many lands. But beneath this glittering surface, the civilization was rotting from within. The corruption of Atlantis illustrates a pattern that Plato saw repeated throughout history. Civilizations rise through virtue and fall through vice. Success breeds complacency, complacency breeds corruption, and corruption breeds destruction. The very qualities that make a civilization great contain the seeds of its eventual decline. This pattern is not inevitable. Plato believed that it was possible for a society to maintain its virtue even in prosperity. The early Atlanteans had done so for many generations, but it requires constant vigilance, constant effort, constant attention to the things that truly matter. When that vigilance lapses, when that effort slackens, when that attention wanders, decline begins. The story of Atlantean corruption is a warning to all civilizations, including our own. Wealth and power are dangerous gifts. They can be used for good or for ill. They can elevate a society or destroy it. Everything depends on the character of the people who possess them, on their values, their priorities, their understanding of what makes life worth living. The gods had watched the decline of Atlantis with growing concern. Poseidon, who had founded the civilization and blessed it with abundance, saw his descendants abandon the virtues he had instilled in them. The other gods observed a people who had been given every advantage squandering their inheritance through folly and vice. For a long time, the gods were patient. They gave the Atlanteans opportunities to reform, to return to the ways of their ancestors, to remember the divine element within them. But the Atlanteans did not change. Instead, they grew worse with each passing generation, sinking deeper into corruption and further from the divine. Zeus, the king of the gods, was the guardian of justice and the punisher of wrongdoing. He had overthrown his own father to establish a reign of order in the cosmos. He maintained the balance between gods and mortals, rewarding virtue and punishing vice. When mortals transgressed too far, when they violated the fundamental laws of the universe, Zeus intervened. The corruption of Atlantis had reached a point where intervention was necessary. The Atlanteans had become a threat not only to themselves, but to the entire world. Their aggressive expansion endangered other peoples. Their example corrupted other societies. Their very existence was an affront to the divine order. Zeus perceived that the Atlanteans, once an admirable race, had become depraved. He saw that they had lost the ability to recognize their own degradation. He understood that they would not reform themselves, that they had passed the point where voluntary change was possible. Something had to be done. The king of the gods decided to call a council. He summoned the other deities to his dwelling place, which Plato describes as located at the center of the universe, from which all things that partake of generation can be seen. This cosmic vantage point allowed Zeus to survey the entire world and to show the other gods what had become of Atlantis. The council of the gods was a solemn assembly. The greatest powers in the universe gathered to deliberate on the fate of a civilization. They would decide whether Atlantis should be punished, and if so, what form that punishment should take. The stakes could not have been higher. Plato's dialogue breaks off at this point, leaving us to imagine what was said in the divine council. The Critias, which contains the detailed description of Atlantis, is unfinished. We do not know whether Plato intended to complete it or whether he deliberately left the ending open, but we know from the Timaeus what the outcome was. Atlantis was destroyed. We can speculate about what arguments might have been made in the Council of the Gods. Some deities might have urged mercy, pointing to the divine origins of the Atlanteans and the greatness they had once achieved. Others might have demanded strict justice, arguing that the Atlanteans had been given every opportunity to reform and had refused. Poseidon's position would have been particularly complex. As the founder and patron of Atlantis, he had a special connection to the civilization. He had loved Plato and blessed their descendants. He had provided the island with its abundance and shaped its landscape with his own hands. The destruction of Atlantis would be the destruction of his own creation. Yet Poseidon was also a god of justice, one who punished those who violated the sacred laws of hospitality and honor. The Atlanteans had betrayed everything he had given them. They had perverted his gifts, using their wealth and power for evil rather than good. Perhaps Poseidon himself concluded that his descendants deserved punishment. Zeus, in the end, made the decision. He determined that the Atlanteans should be punished, that their civilization should be destroyed, that the corruption they represented should be wiped from the earth. The punishment would be severe but just, proportionate to the magnitude of Atlantean crimes. The form of the punishment was fitting for a people who had been blessed by the god of the sea. Water, which had been Atlantis's greatest asset, would become the instrument of its destruction. The island that Poseidon had shaped with rings of water would be swallowed entirely by water. The naval power that had dominated the seas would be claimed by the sea. The involvement of the gods in the destruction of Atlantis gives the story a moral dimension that a purely natural disaster would lack. The Atlanteans were not simply unlucky. They were not victims of random geological forces. They were judged and found wanting. Their destruction was a consequence of their choices, a result of the path they had chosen to walk. This divine judgment reflects Plato's belief in cosmic justice. The universe, in his view, was not morally neutral. It was structured according to principles of order and goodness. When mortals violated these principles, when they disrupted the cosmic order through their wickedness, the universe responded. The gods were agents of this response, instruments through which justice was administered. The destruction of Atlantis was thus both a punishment and a restoration. It punished the Atlanteans for their crimes and restored the balance they had disrupted. It removed a source of corruption from the world and created space for new beginnings. It demonstrated that evil, however powerful it might seem, cannot ultimately prevail. The Council of the Gods also reminds us that human affairs are not conducted in isolation. The gods are watching. The universe is paying attention. Our choices matter not only to ourselves and our immediate neighbours, but to powers far greater than ourselves. This awareness should inspire humility and caution, a recognition that we are part of something larger than ourselves. For the Atlanteans, this awareness came too late. They had forgotten the gods, forgotten their divine origins, forgotten the principles that should have guided their lives. By the time Zeus convened his council, there was nothing left to save. The civilization that had begun with such promise would end in catastrophe, a warning to all future generations about the consequences of forgetting what truly matters. The destruction of Atlantis is one of the most dramatic moments in all of mythology. In a single day and night of terrible violence, an entire civilization vanished from the face of the earth. The catastrophe was sudden, total and irreversible, leaving nothing behind but memory and mystery. Plato describes the destruction in stark terms. There were violent earthquakes and floods. The island of Atlantis was swallowed by the sea and disappeared. The catastrophe happened in a single day and night, a period of time so brief that it seems almost impossible for such complete destruction to occur. The earthquakes would have been devastating. The earth itself turned against the Atlanteans, shaking their buildings to rubble, opening chasms that swallowed entire districts, toppling the magnificent structures they had built over countless generations. The ground that had seemed so solid proved to be treacherous, betraying those who had trusted it. Imagine the terror of those who experienced it. The sudden shaking, the roar of collapsing buildings, the screams of the injured and dying. The magnificent temples of Poseidon crumbling into ruins. The gleaming walls of orichalcum, brass and tin falling into heaps of debris. The bridges that spanned the rings of water cracking and falling into the churning waters below. The floods would have followed quickly. Water poured over the land, sweeping away everything in its path. The rings of water that had been such a distinctive feature of Atlantean engineering overflowed their banks, merging into a single overwhelming deluge. The sea, which had been the source of Atlantean power, became the instrument of Atlantean destruction. The harbours that had sheltered thousands of ships were inundated. The vessels that had carried Atlantean trade across the world were smashed against the docks or swept out to sea. The warehouses filled with goods from distant lands were flooded, their contents ruined or carried away by the waters. The great plain that had fed the Atlantean population was submerged. The elaborate canal system that had irrigated the land became channels for destruction, carrying the floodwaters across the landscape. The farms and villages that had dotted the plain were wiped away, leaving no trace of the people who had lived and worked there. The mountains that had surrounded the plain offered no refuge. The earthquakes triggered landslides that buried entire communities. The floods reached even the higher elevations, driven by the force of the cataclysm. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, no escape from the universal destruction. The central island, where the palace of the kings and the temple of Poseidon stood, was not spared. The most sacred sites of Atlantean civilization were destroyed along with everything else. The orichalcum pillar where the laws were inscribed, the golden statues of the 10 kings, the colossal image of Poseidon in his chariot, all were swallowed by the earth or the sea. The people of Atlantis perished with their civilization. The kings in their palaces, the priests in their temples, the soldiers in their barracks, the merchants in their shops, the farmers in their fields, all were killed by the earthquakes and floods. An entire population, millions of people, died in a single day and night. The overseas empire of Atlantis would have been thrown into chaos by the destruction of the homeland. The territories in Europe and Africa that had been ruled from the island suddenly found themselves without masters. Some may have celebrated their liberation. Others may have mourned the loss of order and stability. All would have been affected by the sudden disappearance of the power that had dominated their world. When the catastrophe ended, nothing remained of Atlantis above the surface of the sea. The island that had been larger than Libya and Asia combined had vanished completely. Where a great civilization had stood, there was only water, and not even clear water, but a muddy, impassable barrier that prevented ships from sailing in that region. Plato specifically mentions this muddy sea as evidence of what had happened. The shallow water and the mud were the remains of the sunken island, debris from the destruction that had not yet settled or dispersed. This detail suggests that Plato imagined Atlantis sinking into relatively shallow water, leaving traces that could still be detected in his own time. The muddy sea also served a narrative purpose. It explained why no one had been able to find Atlantis or verify its existence. The region where the island had stood was impassable, preventing exploration. The physical evidence of the catastrophe blocked access to whatever remains might lie beneath the surface. The destruction of Atlantis was complete in a way that few historical catastrophes have been. Cities have been destroyed by earthquakes, floods, volcanic eruptions and wars. But usually something survives, some remnant of what existed before, some foundation on which rebuilding can begin. Atlantis left nothing, or at least nothing that could be found. This completeness has both frustrated and inspired those who have searched for Atlantis over the centuries. If something had survived, if some ruins or artifacts had been discovered, the mystery would have been solved long ago. But the absence of evidence has allowed the legend to persist, to grow, to capture the imagination of generation after generation. The destruction of Atlantis also destroyed the army that had been defeated by Athens. Plato tells us that the Athenian warriors were swallowed by the earth in the same catastrophe that sank Atlantis. This detail is puzzling, since Athens is far from the Atlantic Ocean. Perhaps Plato imagined a global catastrophe that affected the entire Mediterranean world. Perhaps the Athenian army was in Atlantean territory when the destruction occurred. The text does not make this clear. What is clear is that both civilizations were destroyed, both the corrupt and the virtuous, both the aggressors and the defenders. The catastrophe did not discriminate. It swept away everything, good and bad alike, leaving the world to begin again from a lower level of development. The destruction of Atlantis raises profound questions about divine justice. If the catastrophe was punishment for Atlantean wickedness, why were the virtuous Athenians also destroyed? Why did the innocent perish along with the guilty? These questions have troubled readers of Plato's narrative for centuries. One possible answer is that the destruction was not punishment in a narrow sense, but a necessary cleansing. The corruption of Atlantis had spread too far, affecting too many peoples and places. A surgical strike against Atlantis alone would not have been sufficient. The entire system had to be reset. The entire world had to be given a fresh start. Another possible answer is that the virtuous Athenians had completed their purpose. They had demonstrated that virtue could triumph over corruption, that a small city could defeat a great empire. Their example had been established for all time. Their physical survival was less important than the survival of their legacy. A third possible answer is that Plato simply accepted the tragic dimension of existence. Bad things happen to good people. Natural disasters do not respect moral distinctions. The universe is not perfectly just in the short term, even if it tends toward justice in the long term. The destruction of Athens, along with Atlantis, reflects this tragic reality. Whatever the explanation, the destruction of Atlantis marks the end of an era. A civilization that had risen to unprecedented heights of power and achievement was gone. A civilization that had embodied virtue and wisdom was also gone. The world that emerged from the catastrophe was a different world, one that had to rediscover what had been lost. The memory of Atlantis survived only in Egypt, preserved in the archives of the priests who had recorded ancient events. For thousands of years this memory lay dormant, unknown to the wider world. Then Solon came to Egypt, heard the story, and carried it back to Greece. And eventually, Plato wrote it down, ensuring that the memory of Atlantis would never be lost again. In the immediate aftermath of the destruction, the region where Atlantis had stood was transformed. Where once a great island had risen from the sea, there was now only water, but water unlike any other in the world. The sea in that region had become shallow and muddy, choked with the debris of the sunken civilization. Plato describes this muddy sea as an impassable barrier. Ships could not sail through it. The shallow water and the thick mud made navigation impossible. This barrier cut off the Atlantic Ocean from easy access, preventing exploration of the regions beyond. The muddy sea persisted for a long time after the destruction. Plato, writing more than 9,000 years after the supposed events, still refers to it as if it were a known feature of the Atlantic. This suggests that he believed the effects of the catastrophe were still visible in his own time, or at least that traditions about the muddy sea had survived. Modern readers have puzzled over this detail. The Atlantic Ocean is not, in fact, shallow or muddy. Ships have sailed freely through it for centuries. If Atlantis really existed and really sank, the muddy sea that Plato describes has long since cleared. Some researchers have suggested that Plato was referring to a specific region of the Atlantic that was known for difficult navigation. The Sargasso Sea, with its floating mats of seaweed, has been proposed as a possible inspiration. The shallow waters around the Bahamas or the Azores have also been suggested. But none of these regions truly matches Plato's description of an impassable barrier. Others have argued that the muddy sea was simply a literary device, a way of explaining why Atlantis could not be found. By making the region impassable, Plato forestalled the obvious objection that no one had ever discovered the sunken island. The muddy sea was a narrative convenience, not a geographical reality. The aftermath of the destruction would have extended far beyond the immediate region. The loss of Atlantis would have disrupted trade routes throughout the Atlantic and Mediterranean worlds. The power vacuum left by the collapse of the Atlantean Empire would have created instability and conflict. The peoples who had been ruled by Atlantis would have had to find new ways of organizing themselves. The destruction of the Athenian army would have had similar effects in the eastern Mediterranean. Athens, which had just achieved a remarkable victory, was suddenly leaderless and defenseless. The other Greek states, which had been liberated from Atlantean domination, would have had to fend for themselves. The entire political order of the region would have been thrown into chaos. Plato tells us that these catastrophes were followed by others. The Greek world experienced repeated disasters, floods and earthquakes that destroyed civilizations and erased memories. Each time the survivors had to start over, rebuilding from scratch without knowledge of what had come before. This cycle of destruction and renewal continued for thousands of years. Only Egypt escaped this cycle. Protected by its geography, Egypt avoided the worst effects of the catastrophes that devastated other regions. The Nile Valley provided a stable environment where civilization could develop continuously. The Egyptian priests accumulated knowledge over many generations, preserving records of events that had been forgotten elsewhere. This is why the story of Atlantis survived in Egypt when it was lost everywhere else. The Egyptian archives contained accounts of the ancient war, the destruction of Atlantis, and the catastrophe that followed. These accounts were preserved for thousands of years, waiting for someone like Solon to come and learn about them. The aftermath of the destruction also included a kind of forgetting. The peoples of the Mediterranean world lost touch with their own history. They forgot about Atlantis, about ancient Athens, about the great war that had been fought. They developed new civilizations without knowledge of what had come before. This forgetting was not complete. Fragments of memory survived in myths and legends. Stories of floods and sunken lands circulated throughout the ancient world. The Greeks told of Deucalion's flood, which destroyed most of humanity. Other cultures had similar traditions. Perhaps these stories preserved dim memories of real catastrophes, including the one that destroyed Atlantis. The forgetting also affected the physical evidence of the past. The ruins of ancient civilizations were buried, eroded, or destroyed by subsequent events. The artifacts that might have proven the existence of Atlantis were lost. The written records that might have corroborated Plato's account were destroyed. By the time anyone thought to look for evidence, there was little left to find. The aftermath of Atlantis thus presents us with a mystery that may never be solved. If the civilization really existed, the evidence has been lost or hidden. If it was invented by Plato, the invention was so convincing that people have been searching for it ever since. Either way, the destruction was so complete that we are left with only questions. The muddy sea has cleared. The Atlantic is open to navigation. Ships have crisscrossed its waters for centuries, mapping every island, sounding every depth. Yet no trace of Atlantis has been found. The sunken civilization, if it ever existed, remains hidden beneath the waves, waiting perhaps for some future explorer to discover its secrets.